Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Wednesday morning room with Tim Sullivan and me, Maya Matsuoka, as your hosts and moderators. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time on Clubhouse. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good morning to everybody who joined us just now. Today we have another very special guest, James Scott Brew, and we're going to talk about a very hot topic, I would say. But I think that we're going to present views that are nuanced and balanced today. James, so I believe that you are meeting or listening to him for the first time today. James is based in Japan currently. He's an architect, also a musician, a student of story, also a TEDx speaker, and a global speaker on resilient design, also wellness and climate change solutions. And today we're going to talk about resilient Japan, how Japan is a world leader in this field. Of course, if you have been in Japan for, let's say, maybe 2 or 3 years, or if you have been here just for a while during one of the natural disasters that occurred in the country, you already know that Japan and its population, its people, they are very resilient. But what does resilience means? And then what does it mean in architecture and civil building? I think that we are going to touch upon these questions today. And as you know, we are going to open the room for questions and comments after James is done talking. You can join the conversation at any point via the chat, so please don't feel any hesitation to do that. And without any further ado, James, let's start.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. I really appreciate the chance to join this. This is new to me. I haven't been on Clubhouse before, so completely new experience. And to be on one of these platforms without visuals, it's, an architect without visuals, I was thinking is a bit like a taxi driver without a car. You could say take me somewhere, but you really can't imagine it. So I don't think I really have a lot to add to my bio than what you said in the introduction. But I will say that before moving to Japan, I was a principal architect and co-leader of the buildings practice with one of the leading global think and do tanks, Rocky Mountain Institute, which was co-founded by Amory Lovins, kind of one of the leading minds on energy policy and transportation in the U.S. And I also helped grow my own architecture and engineering firm in the U.S., along with my partners from just a handful of people to nearly 200 people, and designed many green, healthy, restorative, and sustainably designed buildings and campuses and communities. And I've only lived in Japan for about 8 years, but I do have a long history with Japan, starting with hosting students from one sister city and starting another sister city in Japan. And while that was so fun and so interesting, I was kind of hooked from that experience as well. I came to Japan the first time in 1997 with a bicycle and a good friend and had a lot of fun. And I didn't think I would ever get back to Japan. Some of you have heard me say this before if you know me. I really thought when I left Japan I was kind of tearing up, like I'm never going to get back here. And little did I know over the next 19 years I'd be coming 37 more times with the last trip here, a one-way ticket 8 years ago again. So I really think Japan is a model of resiliency, and I've kind of been looking at this topic closer as people start to deal with the climate crisis through various means. Reducing carbon, of course, through energy emissions is really critical and an important task. And talking about embodied carbon, the carbon that is sort of captured in the manufacturing and extraction of raw materials and transport of all the materials that make up a building and quite literally all of our infrastructure. So I think that made me think about Japan as because I'm really interested in Edo, Japan, although I don't know much about it. It made me think about all the things that sort of society operated with at that time. For example, if you grew rice but you didn't fish, you might trade some of your rice for fish in sort of a true circular economy. And that led me to thinking about buildings and construction and how many centuries ago, of course, Tokyo had suffered many, or Edo, Japan had suffered many fires, hundreds of them, that were devastating. and it became a common style for sort of planners and the clan leaders at the time to say, let's leave areas of a neighborhood, for example, open as a fire break. And some of the earliest known sort of fire brigades were formed in Edo. And so the idea of responding to resiliency and nature and natural disasters really started early. And of course we know about the 1,500 earthquakes per year on average in Japan, and those existed in Edo times as well. And more importantly, maybe flooding also existed, which is really the basis for a lot of the canals, although they were probably originally constructed mostly for transport. They also led to flood control strategies in early Edo Japan. But these kinds of ideas really made me think about how is Japan dealing with resiliency today? And so I started looking forward and thinking some of the work that my firm does in Japan might be a good place to start, since it's accessible to me. And I found some fantastic things happening, not just in earthquake-resistant design, which of course we expect, and since the Kobe disaster, things have really changed structurally, and even many buildings have, as you probably well know, been retrofit for earthquakes. But beyond that, I started thinking about other things, and I wanted to look at both maybe what has not worked so well and what has worked well. And for example, I know that the mechanical electrical engineers in my firm have spent a good part of the past maybe 5 or 6 years or more moving, renovating existing buildings to move electrical switchgear equipment from the lower level of buildings to the second or third level, or even the roof. And in new designs, we're now seeing a lot of the electrical equipment quite high above the ground level. And this was in part due to I don't know if anybody on this session recalls what happened at Kansai Airport just 4 years ago in September. I think it was Hurricane Jebi. The storm surge flooded the runways, and Terminal 1 building basement completely flooded, and all of the electrical switchgear was in that basement, and the emergency services. So there was no power, a blackout in the building, of course no flights going in or out. And further, a ship was blown into the bridge connecting Kansai Airport to the mainland. And so the trains weren't running, and the buses and taxis weren't coming or going. And many thousands of people were stranded at the airport. I'm not laughing at that situation. I'm just shocked at how one sort of natural disaster, a hurricane, leads to another thing, a blackout, and then the runways flooding, and leads to the ship blowing. One thing leads to another. It's a little bit like the terrifying 2011 Tohoku region disaster, where an earthquake creates a tsunami, and the tsunami melts down the Fukushima plant. So this sort of thinking about scenarios, if you're a scenario planner, where you imagine what could go wrong, if you have a mind that thinks like that, you might be good at sort of resilient design. Because a lot of what we think about in resilient design today is based on this idea of probability. Will this happen? Will we get another earthquake? Yes. Will we get another tsunami? Yes. Will we have more hurricanes? Yes. What's the impact if we have these different scenarios? Is it 0? Is it 5? Let's say on a scale of 5. And you can use this kind of thinking to begin to plan buildings that are more responsive and more able to basically be resilient, because the resilient design strategies will lessen the service level loss of your building or infrastructure, and they will reduce the time that it's not functioning. And I don't know if that's enough for an introduction, or if you want me to continue with a bit more on that line. But I've learned a lot just looking at what Japan has done with resiliency. Actually, I should mention ULI. If you know Urban Land Institute, I think last year, or maybe it was early this year, put out a report on resiliency that I think you can pick up online and download free, on sort of the cultural resiliency of the Japanese people, but also the infrastructure. And that's where I got a lot of ideas about the history. And then also there are some case studies in there of projects that are looking forward. Real estate investors basically thinking, in order to protect their investment, what kind of resilient design strategies should we include here? And when I say here, I mean not just generally Japan, but every site is quite specific for resiliency, right? Because if an area, for example, is not prone to flooding, you might not use some of the flooding strategies, design strategies for that project. And so I like to say that resiliency, like sustainability, is very local.
James, I think that's great, and I would like you to continue. I just wanted to interject one thing that is related to flood control, and this is something that I was completely unaware of. And just prior to the Olympics, this is before they were postponed, a friend of mine has an ad agency, and they were commissioned by, I think it was the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, to translate many articles, and it was aimed at foreigners, non-Japanese, coming to Japan for the Olympics, to just give them background about Tokyo in general. And they were in a crunch, so they asked me as a favor to translate one of the articles, actually a couple, but one of the articles was about the flood control in Tokyo and the underground reservoirs that they've dug, that they've bored, and how when there's an overflow, water in some of the key tributaries in Tokyo are diverted to these underground caverns. And it was just fascinating. I think they actually may give tours down there, obviously when it's not filled up with water. And I also learned that Japan has probably some of the leading technology in the world for, boring underground, both because of the subways they create, things like that. Have you been exposed to any of that?
Yeah, I've heard that, and I've seen photos of the caverns. They're, I think, about 45 kilometers north of Tokyo Central, those big caverns for diverting water during... And this is, again, a sort of a product of the geology and the geography of Japan that we're also familiar with if you live here, where, of course, 75% of the country lives on about 10% of the land, roughly, and the mountains are so close to the ocean. So... yeah, so I was aware of the boring technology, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of the floods and flood control, and even the caverns. I don't think I knew about them right away when I moved here before I did. But I've seen the photos, and they're just fantastic. They do give tours of them. I haven't been to them, but it's quite impressive. Now, is it enough? I don't think so. I think they suspect that there could be rain events, and that is one item that has increased in quantity, if you want to say intensity. Rainfall. I think it's a Tokyo Metropolitan Government study that looked at a 10-year period, I think from maybe the mid-70s to mid-80s, and then later in the mid-90s or later, maybe early 2000s to 2018 or something like that. Anyhow, I think they showed that getting rain events of about 50 millimeters or more on average occurred 1.4 more times more in the second 10-year time period. So I believe that with modeling they can demonstrate we still will have flooded areas. And I know there's a couple of different maps. Usually they're in Japanese, so I struggle with them. Maybe some of you wouldn't. But they're looking at these kinds of hazards, not just floods, but earthquakes and, of course, escape routes and safe roadways during evacuation times. And sort of that disaster response side, which is after, obviously, a major disaster. And what we try to do on the architecture and engineering side is, I don't like to use the words disaster prevention because I don't think they can completely be prevented, but I like to say disaster preparation or maybe, again, resilient design. So catching both sides of this problem, I think Japan is leading the world, in my opinion. And again, in part because of our geography and geology, but also just kind of a condition. I know when I bicycled here in 1997, one of the things I was struck by was how frightening it was for me to bicycle through these tunnels, across Japan. And many of them don't have, as you know, a shoulder or a safe place to ride your bicycle. You just have to take your chances. And I knew then that Japanese have to be brilliant at boring, not being super familiar with the subway system at that time.
Yeah, James, it's so funny. Zooming out a little bit, and we talk about serendipity sometimes. You and I think we hooked up maybe 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And we had a offline chat, and you talked about resiliency. And as fate would have it, and without going into the content of it, I saw a snippets of a podcast by Lex Fridman, and he had some experts on about climate change. And it dovetailed with many of the points you were making, and again, zooming out, one of the things that struck me is that we have to approach the climate change problem from different angles. We can't just rely on one. Many people will say, stopping the climate change is probably too late. We may be able to mitigate it. That's up for debate. But I didn't hear a lot about us building for resilience. And by talking to you, it struck me as this is probably the most practical, relatively short-term measures we can take at this point. And that's why I'm just really interested in, just hearing more of what you have to say today about, the role of, for example, an architect or city planners in making us more resilient. And some of it is how we build, and some of it is where we do build and where we don't develop. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I have more now, especially since I've seen that. But I have to say, and this is really hard to say without sounding maybe a little bit, you don't necessarily want to, I'm not trying to score points for any given country in the world, but sometimes when we see an RFP for some new city proposal, grand scale city in some desert somewhere in the world, I always have a hiccup in a stop in my step, because I just think, is that really sustainable? Is there any way to build that and it will sustain itself forever? And right now I think there's a proposal, I'm just forgetting now for a second the name of this city that's like a wall. It's like the Line. It might be called the Line or something like that. It's this multi-kilometer long city in the desert that I just don't think we should build. And I do think when we do experience disasters, it doesn't mean we'll experience another one of those in the same place, and even within a certain time frame. When we hear those terms like a 100-year storm or a 500-year storm or a 1,000-year storm, you can get a 500-year storm or a 1,000-year storm 3 years in a row, and you can get two in the same year. But you're right. I just don't know that we're thinking in terms of development patterns well enough about what could happen. Again, it's scenario planning, and I envision there may be a practice being born or created either within or a subset of architecture and engineering around this idea of sort of climate resilient design, and where people are maybe getting some level of certification of expertise or knowledge or information to be able to serve clients or developers who own large plots of land and might be looking at putting something there, whether it makes sense or not. And certainly we have zoning and planning regulations. It's actually one of the things I liked most about Japan, visiting here so much and now living here, is there's sort of a perception that there is no zoning or planning because it's so mixed use, and that's what makes it so livable and so walkable and so able to be, you don't need a car to get everything you need to get in your life. We don't have a car, for example. I sold my last car while I was living in Minnesota about 15 years ago. And anyway, I do think that there's some planning and zoning that has to sort of weave into what developers want to put on a given plot, and if it makes sense, or maybe it doesn't make sense. Because I think the reinsurance industry, we're hearing more and more about that every year, because these folks keep the numbers, and you can find information out there about the reinsurance industry and losses that are occurring where they're starting to say, we're not going to insure anything built in this zone again, after a major hurricane wipes out something. But we're also hearing, I don't know if anyone on this chat has heard of the hurricane in Florida, recent hurricane, and the town, Babcock Ranch. It's a neighborhood name basically in Florida that survived the hurricane, pretty much a direct hit. Not necessarily, I don't think, because of its sort of waterways and flood control, and maybe in part the design for high winds, but mostly it was about energy. They didn't lose any power because it's mostly solar powered, all sort of distributed energy systems, if you will. And there's some good stories of coming out of some disasters sometimes that we learn, and I think Japan has done that probably again better than most countries do. I think I told you this, Tim. I recall as just a young child, I don't know if I was 11 or what, but I remember seeing some hurricane had wiped out some place in America, in Louisiana or Florida, and East Coast, or maybe Southwest. And then they were interviewing people and talking about rebuilding. These people are mentioning, "Oh, are you going to rebuild?" And they're, "Yes, absolutely." And of course, there's a love and a connection to place that we all have, where no matter where you're from or where you are now, you end up somehow forever connected to that place in some meaningful way. But this is sometimes, it looks, even to a child, it looks a little bit silly sometimes to put something back where it's well known that it's going to continue to flood in a floodplain. And this is an aside. I don't know that it's interesting to anyone, but I like to say this now because I work in this area. But I lost my home of 25 years in northern Minnesota to climate change, I like to say, or a climate-fueled storm. But it was just because they were calling it a 500, or some meteorologists were calling it a 1,000-year storm. And nobody had flood insurance because we weren't in a floodplain. Yet all of us flooded and destroyed my house and lost all of the equity in it overnight. Technically it was over a few days because the really big rain event really happened in one day, but it was preceded by several days of light rain, which the soil was already saturated. So I can share at least some of I can empathize a little bit with people who've suffered losses from natural disasters. But I remember thinking when I got the news that the money didn't really matter. I remember thinking it was the loss of a place that you lived and the loss of a place where you had memories that mattered a lot more than the money in a situation like that.
Yeah, my brother has a home in Florida. It's his second home, and he recently had to weather that hurricane. His basement and garage got flooded, but relative to the people in his neighborhood, he came out fine, and he collected money from, what is it, FEMA. But yes, and the whole insurance industry, that's changing, and I've heard they won't even give flood insurance anymore. So we definitely have to find ways to cope. But hey, we got Yuka on stage. Good morning, Yuka. Thank you for coming up.
Good morning. Thank you. Hello, James. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Yuka.
I'm sorry to hear about your house, but actually, we currently live in Dallas, and then I'm sure we're going to share some of the natural challenges going forward. And I'm kind of worried about, the Texas being Texas. We have we're our own power grid, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. But anyway, I'm sorry, I digressed.
No, it's related.
Yeah. I have a quick question first, and then more deeper, or to me at least, have a question that I have a tendency of asking from the left field, and Timothy and Maya are kind of used to. So if you could please bear with me, James. So could you go back and let me know, you're living in Japan. You've lived in Japan for 8 years. And then you sort of repeatedly stated that Japanese, oops, I get the poor connection. But anyway, the Japanese architect or sort of building standards are resilient. And I love the word resilient. But so what you think that's caused by? What driving the Japanese to be resilient? It's just because we're so prone to natural disasters, or so we're so forced to, or what is your take on it? If you could please share. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Yuka. I think, it really dates back. It's easy to look at the last 100 years, and we can talk about all the horrific things that have happened to Japan and the various large earthquakes, maybe starting with the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, September 1st, which flattened Tokyo mostly, and not to mention, all of the World War II stuff, and there must obviously have been numerous typhoons and tsunamis, earthquakes dating back thousands of years, and even if you look back at the history of Japanese castles, the first castles built in Japan were actually stone. And the Japanese learned quite quickly that the stone castles of China do not stand up to the earthquakes of Japan. They're too rigid. And the Japanese quickly adapted and switched to wood. And wood flexes and moves with the earthquake, of course, and can survive most of them. It doesn't mean it's earthquake-proof. And I don't think that all Japanese architects and designers in all buildings are resilient. Even the ones any one firm does, everything doesn't get the sort of same level of maybe care and feeding around resilience. However, we've had more clients since 2011 that even stopped the projects. We had a couple of notable ones where they were stopped and then restarted with new goals around not just earthquake design, but all kind of types of resiliency. I don't know if you're aware, Yuka, of this term. It's pronounced in sort of katakana-esque way, BCP. BCP is this business continuity planning. When I first heard of it, I thought, what is that for? If there's a major disaster, aren't we worried about the people? And what BCP is basically resilient sort of operations of the building. And it means mostly emergency power, emergency water, and it's not law, but it's sort of a philosophy that almost every good designer worth their salt and almost every good client asks for. 72 hours of building operation under emergency conditions. That means power and water have been cut off to the building, probably sewerage as well, because of a big earthquake or some event. And we need to take care of business or people, I assume it's both, for at least 3 days. And so many projects sort of extended that and started saying, well, we need more than that. We need to take care of people in a more meaningful way. For example, I think everybody probably on this call knows that there were about 3.52 million people stranded in Tokyo on March 11th, 2011. And at any given station, there were tens of thousands of people trying to find a way home and either walking on the roads, and I think Maya and others have told me personal stories of these kinds of sites and what they saw. And we had a client that wanted to do at one station, at least it's a phase 2 of the building project, we did a large public plaza where it could be pop-up shops, but it also would connect 2 sides of the railway station that are now kind of divided, like a lot of big railway stations tend to divide a town at that point, naturally, at grade level or ground level. But this client envisions this in very large. They can not only connects businesses together, so it serves to, if you will, share the customer, because this client has built an office tower, a headquarters building for their operations. But they wanted this public, I call it an area of refuge assistance, sort of a rescue assistance, because it really, they said, would serve in a large disaster as a place where people could go, where emergency pop-up housing could be, literally tents, could be put up, and food could be distributed that's stored. And I just thought, what a wonderful spirit of community that a client has because of the tragedy of 2011. So looking from history all the way through to more recent events, I just think Japanese have been on a continuous learning more than any other country. If we look across the world, there are places that on a risk index maybe have a higher potential economic risk, but I don't think so many people so close together that have so many natural disasters exist this way. I mean, you could look at, I suppose, Manila and maybe some other Southeast Asian areas that might be somewhat equally at risk, but I actually don't know if they have even the same level of earthquakes, four per day on average.
Thank you, James. That's a great response. It's interesting when you mentioned the BCP. I'm in the financial industry, and when we hear the term BCP, the first thought that we have is how to protect the client's data. So, like you said, so it's more critical to protect the human lives. So, I was just thinking about that. So, so let me just throw this to you, and then, if this is so out of your turf, just tell me, please. Sure. I've been really sort of thinking about this, like, the Japanese are known to be unhappy. And then it's, they're the very high risk aversion sentiment. And then they said the part of the reason is because high, probability of natural disaster. So can we sort of create some system to sort of at least ease those anxiety from the people's minds? Technology it's going to be available? I
think that's a really interesting question because I I don't know that my answer is the best one. And again, if the roots of that unhappiness, because I saw a report with a wonderful picture of a sort of distraught-looking office worker woman with their head resting on her hand, and it said, Japanese, the world's saddest office workers. That was the title of an article less than a year after I moved here in the Japan, one of the big publications here. In any case, I started looking at that topic because I wondered the same thing. Why so unhappy? This is such a great place. I was still on a honeymoon moving here, and I was just like so excited. And I started asking my colleagues about it. And I don't know that it's the same, of course, for everyone if that feeling of impending disaster is coming. But I do feel that we sometimes get wrapped up in policies. And what I mean by policies is the company has control over policy. And some domestic companies in Japan are quite well known for relatively rigid historic rules. In other words, they follow the rules that have always been done. And I think I told Tim this before, and maybe Maya, that working at a company that does work quite internationally, I don't feel like I'm working for one of those kind of rigid companies. I feel like there's a lot of flexibility and so forth. But my real answer to your question, it would be around this idea of nature. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But I think everybody knows we evolved in and with nature, but now we build and live on top of nature. If you see photos, if you look back or even just think back to very early settlements anywhere in the world, and there's a wonderful book. It's not about settlements, by the way. It's about comfort. It's called Thermal Delight in Architecture. A real thin book, 1979, MIT Press, and I used to make students read this when I was teaching at University of Colorado in architecture and engineering, and this book really just talks about how different cultures sought comfort historically, before fossil fuel, if you will, BFF. And I believe that some of the answer for happiness, sort of looking ahead, is not about thermal comfort alone, which is a metric that we've sort of managed to seal up the box, if you will, of buildings, put people in a sealed box, put it at a one fixed temperature and a steady, very non-flickering light control. And if you have a light meter, which by the way you can download for free on your iPhone, and go outside even on a cloudy rainy day like it is in Tokyo today, and you can walk outside and the light meter will never stop. It's constantly changing. The numbers are changing in lux or foot candles, whatever you're measuring. And the reason for that is sunlight and daylight is constantly being filtered through the atmosphere by particulate matter that's in the air. Now, we've put a lot of that in the air, but it's always been there, particulate matter in the air. And clouds, of course, bringing shadows and sunlight. And our bodies and our minds and our stories, everything we do naturally, our instincts, come from a response to nature and not to sort of this zoo-like environment that we've created. In fact, I have a slide. I don't remember if I told Tim and Maya this, but I have a slide in some of my presentations about showing a Victorian office with wooden floors, wooden desks, wooden chairs, high ceilings, and big operable windows, because there was no central ventilation or central heating in the 1890s, really. And then I show a zoo from about the same period. It's a lion in a cage behind steel bars in a tiny cell with a concrete floor, a dead tree. And then I show an office today in Japan. And this office is, just again, like I described, a sealed box with a fixed climate and even lighting. And then I show a zoo today. And I haven't been to Ueno Zoo ever, but I've been to a couple of the big zoos in America, doing projects for them on energy conservation. And there are no steel bars at these zoos anymore. And animals like the lions have huge habitats that they can wander through, all natural. I mean, they're outdoors. And they're behind thick glass. But you have to wonder which environment has really improved most. And so this response to happiness today is really, I think, being centered in a conversation is occurring, which again, I have to tell you, I think Japan is a leader in. I'm not just saying that, I'm plenty critical, but in biophilic design. If you Google biophilic design, and in fact, there's an award now for architects in biophilic design. It started in 2017, the Stephen Kellert Biophilic Design Award. And anyway, that award recognizes this idea of bringing nature into buildings. And by the way, bringing nature into buildings isn't just bringing plants or water features into a building. Those are real powerful elements of nature that we instantly recognize. But it could be biophilic patterns, colors. In fact, color is one of the things that we used in our evolution to identify where something was poisonous, this berry is poisonous, or under that yellow tree at this season. There are apples. We knew that these sources of food were responses to color. And we knew when a fruit was ripe or not ripe, again, also by color. So color is something that is a natural response. And sometimes I go in these offices that are black and white and gray, and I just shake my head because we really are not understanding the evolution of humans and how we can have it. And there's lots and lots of research from the International Living Futures Institute. They have lots cited on their website. And there's a couple of good papers by Bill Browning on looking at the economics of biophilic design that look at the research behind a positive human response. And why all this, and how does it relate to happiness? I would say you can measure it through worker engagement. And worker engagement, 2/3 of office workers around the world, and I think, I'm trying to remember how many countries, 23 countries, 7,600 people in a survey on biophilic design. They're asking office workers about their office conditions. Are disengaged. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up two polls. One is the Gallup poll on office engagement, and the other is on biophilic design. But these two can be put together as sort of bookends to this question, where office workers are unhappy and they're disengaged for many reasons at work. Of course, again, varying with policies and their work environment. For example, almost half the workers in a poll on biophilic design, that's half of 7,600 workers, said they don't have access to daylight or plants or color in their office environment. And that's just almost horrific, that you don't have any daylight. And just access to views. The top 5 things people wanted, I think, were access to views. They wanted more plants. Of course, daylight. They need that. That comes with the views generally. They wanted quiet places to work, which is also, I would say, a biophilic response if we think of quiet nature, peaceful nature. And I'm just forgetting the 5th one off the top of my head right now. But in any case, this connection to nature, I think, can be a response to engagement, but also raising our happiness. Because if you're engaged in your work, your happiness immediately goes up. If people, for example, have a person at work that they can actually call a friend, a close friend, someone they could confide in, they are happier in their work and they're more engaged in their work, meaning they're more productive. And cognitive function is a measure of productivity or performance. And so that has been tested in a number of research projects where you can take and isolate one condition, for example, CO2 level in the office environment, increased ventilation, what impact does it have on cognitive, and you take 9 standardized cognitive function tests, subjects do, not knowing what they're being tested for or why they're being tested. We can consistently show that people perform better in highly ventilated, that means mixed temperature buildings too. But when you go into a building, again, fixed temperature, what people really want is different zones, because you and me and she don't have the same sort of feeling, maybe even the same clothing level today at work. And one of us might feel cold while the other one feels extremely hot. So we want this variability of nature in offices. And my firm is looking very closely at this and doing a lot of research on mixed mode. We call it, where buildings are more open to nature. We imagine this is, and our research in engineering shows that this is also a good response for infectious disease control and spread of viruses. So mixed mode sort of means we might have to have some artificial air conditioning because of the climate. But how can we control that air conditioning and operate it in such a way that it's super energy efficient, where we can take advantage of light breezes that might be coming from the outdoors and shading that's designed into the building, and maybe plants that are evaporating water that helps cool us naturally, as in thermal delight in architecture. So very long and complex answer, but I just think there is at least some levers we could pull on the happiness thing, but it's probably not just saying, oh, don't worry, you'll be safe from all natural disasters, which I wish we could say, and I don't think we will be able to.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we always, when we talk about resilience, we think about natural disasters or man-made disasters, accidents, and so on. But there is so much more to it, actually. And as you mentioned, so making people happy with what they do and with where they are it has so much to do with resilience as well, and also sustainability. But I'm not going to touch upon sustainability because it's another very, very big topic, and sometimes it's just like a well that has no bottom. Sorry. But anyway, so thank you for doing that, because resilience is, I think that, basically because we're talking also about Japan now, it's built into the Japanese society, and that the cultural aspects of it are here, also the technical aspects of it are here. And I think that especially in Japan, the society here, the construction companies, especially in the recent 1 or 2 decades, they have been working very hard to actually further develop that resilience. And it's just fascinating how cultural aspects, technical aspects, social aspects, they all come together.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I don't think I was as sensitive to this not living here. And certainly I saw and heard about what was happening while I was living in America during 3/11. But people in America and other countries were saying, oh, the Japanese people are so stoic and they're so strong. But yeah, the cultural response to disasters, or the human resilience, if you will, is really fascinating. And that is part of this ULI report I mentioned earlier. And this perseverance, what do you say, gaman, that reflects the tenacity
Yes.
of sort of the people. And it's a celebrated trait, I think, or a characteristic that's somehow taught through your life as a Japanese person. And I read something recently about those little red daruma dolls that you see that have the unpainted eyes, where you fill in the left eye when you make a wish, right? And then if that wish comes true, you fill in the right eye and then you donate it to your temple or something. And the article was saying, I didn't know this because I don't have one of those dolls, but that I didn't know that the bottom of those are rounded, or if I did know, I didn't pay attention. And they're weighted. I don't know if I've ever picked one up. And the daruma doll, when you bump it, or even your home experiences a small earthquake and it moves, it doesn't fall over. So it can't fall over. It stands up all the time. And in this article, the author was saying something about a Japanese proverb that I don't remember exactly, but it was about 7 times knocked down or something, 8 times getting up, is connected to this sort of culture of, and I don't know if that's the meaning behind the daruma doll not falling over, but it's sort of like, I liked it, and I thought that's a really interesting thing. It's not just about a dream and a dream coming true, but it's about perseverance and about not falling down, or if you do fall down, get up. And a really wonderful way to think about human resilience, and how it really does, as you said, Maya, really get connected to the technological and architectural and structural capabilities of the Japanese. And altogether, yeah, I think this is still is something I've said to many people. We can export this, and I don't mean necessarily for money, but it's an idea that the Japanese people can bring to the world in this climate crisis to share lessons, if you will. And whatever the hazard might be facing some area in some part of the world, I hope people will more and more turn to the Japanese for a way to maybe transcend the climate crisis.
James, I just want to say thank you so much for your response to Yuka's question, because it exposed some of my own blind spots. And, they say, if you have a hammer, you're going to look for nails to pound. Well, as a student of culture, I tend to look at the non-physical dimensions of happiness, or the flip side of, the sources of unhappiness. And you mentioned, the idea of making people safe or feeling safe doesn't necessarily drive their happiness. And I recall in the late 1970s, when I was living in Japan, and I always thought how unhappy the Japanese people looked when I would take the train, for example. Although I don't think Americans are necessarily a very happy culture either. And then I went to the Philippines, and I saw people in abject poverty who looked so happy. They were laughing, and they had human connections, and it was kind of a revelation to me. But to that point, you mentioned gaman, right? And I think it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's a very admirable trait. But again, looking at it from a cultural point of view, I like to often say that it's very tough to be Japanese because they're living in this social pressure cooker. And there's this extreme pressure to conform. And I always felt that was one dimension that made it maybe difficult for some people to be happy. And just from my own experience, moving back to the U.S. with my wife, my Japanese wife, suddenly she felt a freedom that she never felt before. And that this big weight was lifted off of her, where she didn't have to worry about giving, the twice-a-year chugen and seibo gifts and making my boss's wife happy. And she said, I'm free. So that's the dimension that I default to but now I have a much better understanding of the maybe equally important, I don't know, but factors are just related to the environment that you're working in. So I thought it was a really, really good answer.
Yeah, and that's really, you're absolutely right. I wonder, sometimes I wonder how bad it is to be a nonconformist to whatever societal pressures and rules have been created. And I don't know if you're outcast or what might happen to you, but it's just something that isn't lost on me either, that I'm getting away with a lot of things that a lot of people cannot get away with in Japan, because I'm not Japanese when you see me. And so, that's really interesting. And I remembered the same response you had going to the Philippines, Tim. I used to go to Mexico pretty much every year for almost 20 years, and one of my earliest trips, and I went to fairly remote places that weren't well known, and that was by design. And I remember seeing, the same thing, people that appeared, at least, with to be living in poverty, and so happy, and we couldn't understand, and my friends and I, and so I remember having a conversation with a young Mexican gentleman, and he summed it up so well. He said, "You are American. You live to work." And he said, "We are Mexican. We work to live." And it just never left my mind, that idea that living to work and working to live are completely different things. Just, you only need to work enough to eat today. Tomorrow is another day. We only have to worry about tomorrow. That's why they're so happy today. Wow.
And yet Mexicans are hard workers.
I'm sorry. Yeah, they are. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it's just so ironical. I'm doomed on both ends. I'm Japanese living in the U.S. So I'm like, okay. Anyway, I'm sorry, Timothy.
Funny.
Please, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it was interesting because the Mexicans are very hard workers too, but that, they still
that's true.
Somehow find that balance, right? Go ahead, Yuka. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Before the you guys close this room, I just have to throw this question because I'm all about cheating, James. So before I do, I Google biophilic design. Could you sort of throw some good colors that we should have around us? Because my husband and I are arguing about the color of the wall of our living room. So I'm like, he just knocked down the wallpaper, which was pink. So, I don't want to, make it sound that he was correct. But could you throw me some sort of advice, please? What's the best color?
I don't think there is a single best color, but I know one thing we did at my first home that I lost was we experimented with that idea of changing the color quite often in the living room. I know it's a lot of work, but it was kind of fun to do that, to use an accent wall, and tried natural patterns. We tried, darker colors and brighter colors. There is something perhaps personal in color selection, but there's also something in, maybe if you're one of the followers of feng shui, feng shui, you might pre-select a color that fits into your sort of family heritage, yellow or something, and there could be a directional thing, that the sunlight comes through this window and shines on this wall, and we want to reflect more light because it's dark over here. So there's maybe a multiple layer response, which is why there's no one good color. And sometimes you can see something that's red or blue in a house and be struck as like, that's awful. But other times you see it in a photograph, on some website, and you go, wow, that is really stunning and looks powerful. So I would say experiment.
Okay, thank you.
I hate to cut this off because I love this conversation. This was just so much fun for me. And I certainly hope we can have you back in the future, James, for other topics, because I know the audience loved it too.
Well, thank you so much. I'd love to join again sometime.
Maya, any closing comments?
Yes, thank you, James, for being our guest speaker today, and to everybody. Thank you, everybody who joined us. We appreciate your being here. We hope that, today's conversation was an interesting and insightful one for you. If you thought so, please tell your friends. This conversation the audio will remain in Clubhouse, and also a week later it will be uploaded on YouTube on Japan Expert Insights there, so you can listen to it there as well. Well, I believe that we'll continue talking about this topic in the future, and of course, if you have questions about it, let us know. I also encourage you to connect with James here on Clubhouse, also on LinkedIn. And just if you want to communicate deeper with him, please do that too. Thank you very much, Yuka. Thank you for coming. Well, with this, I wish you a great day and a very successful remainder of the week. We're looking forward to having you again here. And that's it. Thank you for tuning in today. We will be on air next week on Wednesday at 8 a.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make the best of the day. See you!